Arthur Bach is all boozed up and dressed up in his Batman suit and calls out to Bitterman. Bitterman, a stout man, appears in an unflattering Robin costume. Arthur questions why he has shaving cream on his face, and Bitterman responds that Robin doesn't have a beard, so he must shave. Arthur clarifies that they are doing this just for a bit of a laugh, and are not in fact genius crime fighters. If they were, he wouldn't be his choice for a sidekick. Arthur tears apart Bitterman's outfit and reminds him of his position as his chauffeur. Bitterman questions whether Arthur really wants to go to his mother's fundraiser looking like Batman. Bitterman conveys to Arthur that the dress code was black tie and this might lead to trouble. But Arthur isn't one to be convinced easily, since he has even bought the Batmobile to show up to the party in style. Bitterman drives the Batmobile with Arthur dressed up as Batman inside, while cop cars and helicopters chase them down. They try to stop, but press the wrong buttons and crash the Batmobile instead, which is when the cops surround them. Bitterman thinks that they should ask the cops for directions to the museum where the fundraiser is, but Arthur wants him to stay quiet. He tries to get out of the Batmobile but is restricted by the statue's metal genitals. The cops call him out for being drunk again, but he clarifies that he has remained drunk since their last encounter. He is brought out of his vehicle and offers the cops a bribe to compensate for the damage to the landmark he just destroyed. But they arrest him and Bitterman instead, and take them to prison. Meanwhile, his mother, Vivienne, is at the fundraiser for Modernism Against Poverty, organized by their family company, Bach Worldwide. She is talking about the market trends with the chancellor of a university, and assures him that Arthur has become more serious and involved with the subject of finance. This is when her shrewd assistant, Susan, gets a notification on her phone about Arthur's recent arrest. Susan shows Vivienne the news, and so does everyone else at the party, as the news circulates pretty fast. The chancellor of the university now refuses to wager his endowment on a fund with such an uncertain future. Vivienne grows concerned about what beholds Arthur's fate, so Susan suggests that some level of commitment might do him good. When Arthur and Bitterman are released from jail, so are all the other prisoners because Arthur paid for their release. He found it unfair to leave them behind in jail and is now surrounded by the press covering the news of his release from prison. One of the reporters asks for his explanation of this frivolous spending during a recession. He later solves this problem by giving everyone around him free money, as he believes that this is what can cure a recession. The next morning, Arthur's nanny, Hobson, cleans up around the huge mansion where he partied hard last night. She makes her way to Arthur's bedroom and opens the door without any knocking or permission to enter. Arthur is busy with a lady friend called Tiffany, and Hobson commends him for remembering his lover's name this time. Arthur introduces Hobson as his best friend in the whole world. Hobson adds that the reason why Arthur is so attached to his nanny is because he only has the body of an adult. Hobson opens all the blinds in the room and informs Arthur that Vivienne wants to see him. This probably has something to do with destroying a world-class landmark and giving away $78,000 from an ATM. Hobson checks Tiffany's purse and discovers a stolen gold watch inside that she retrieves. Then, she deletes all the pictures of last night from Tiffany's camera, after which she exits, calling Arthur and Hobson weird. Hobson escorts out all the party animals who crashed at Arthur's mansion because they have to return to the real world. Arthur hates this real world and decides to work from bed today, which means drinking in bed. It is time for Arthur to have his breakfast with Hobson, who doesn't let him drink more alcohol. They also read the newspaper together. Arthur takes his bath while watching cartoons and peeking out of the glass windows of his skyscraper with a pair of binoculars. He calls Hobson and shows her two women he spotted on the street. He has a strange talent for identifying lesbians. Hobson leaves with one last instruction for Arthur, which is to thoroughly clean his genitals. Later on, Hobson gets him dressed and brings him to the office for a meeting with Vivienne. Arthur is walking to Vivienne's office when he encounters Susan. He awkwardly avoids eye contact with her, but she confidently says hello to him. They talk and it's revealed that they dated for 3 months at the beginning of the year. He still owes her a call because he completely disappeared from her, just like Houdini. Susan inches closer to him and discloses that he's the only man she slept with who broke up with her. But Arthur believes that conversations are essential for relationships, which isn't something they used to do. Susan wishes him luck and he goes on to see Vivienne. They struggle with greeting each other comfortably and awkwardly shake hands. Vivienne mentions all the fun Arthur has been having recently, but he contradicts this claim with the point that he has been rather busy. He is about to walk out of this conversation when Vivienne addresses the complex nature of their relationship. He mainly blames Vivienne for it, but she shifts the weight on him by showing him pictures of the atrocious antics he has been up to lately. Vivienne doesn't understand why Arthur squanders his intelligence in idiocy. Arthur doesn't think of these shenanigans as idiocy but as defying the Grim Reaper with fun. He seems done with his justification but sits back down on Vivienne's command. She explains that when the sole heir of a corporation as big as theirs gets arrested, it frightens investors. The solution Vivienne has come up with is Susan. Arthur knows Susan to be someone who dresses well but has borderline personality disorder. Vivienne plans for her to get married to Arthur because she is an impressive woman. Vivienne shows him pictures of all of Susan's achievements, and Arthur is disappointed in her for using marriage as a tool for protecting a corporate image. Vivienne is left with no choice but to declare that Arthur is cut off as of this moment. Arthur retaliates that he isn't going to let her manipulate him and will get married when he falls in love. Vivienne respects his integrity but not the fact that he is just about to walk out on $950 million. This acknowledgement is enough to bring Arthur back, as Susan doesn't seem so bad to him now. He congratulates Vivienne on her win and she appreciates his talent for self-preservation. Arthur holds a valuable ring in his hand that Hobson identifies as the one his father proposed to his mother with. Arthur admits that he doesn't like Susan very much and Hobson reminds him that she doesn't like him a lot too, but they've happily stuck together for 30 years. Hobson knows that these circumstances aren't perfect, but she thinks that Susan will be good for him in the long run. Since Arthur is left with no other choice than to accept his fate, he decides to feel better by squandering his wealth. He buys overpriced auction items that aren't even of any use to him, such as Abraham Lincoln's suit. He wears the suit on the streets, on which Hobson makes it very clear that he's deluded if he thinks of this as a victory over Vivienne's financial tyranny. Hobson looks for Bitterman in the car while Arthur wanders off and ends up at the Grand Central Station. There, he hears a young woman tell someone that this place is the Grand Central Terminal instead. Arthur focuses on her and asks her where he can find a drink by taking off his top hat. The young woman, Naomi, takes out some loose change from her pocket and drops it in his hat, thinking he is a beggar. She continues by giving some people a tour of the place while Arthur finds himself engrossed in her carefree, spirited beauty. He follows her to a different spot where she's lying on the floor with the tourists, looking up at the stars drawn on the ceiling. He lies down with her and is trying to get her attention when a police officer arrives there. He has warned Naomi before that she can't give tours without a license and her tour is impeding foot traffic at the station. Arthur starts talking to the officer, which gives Naomi a chance to slip out of there, but the officer starts to chase her. Arthur is glad to chase her, which makes him feel exhilarated. But this doesn't last long because Naomi is soon caught by the officers, who have already given her 3 warnings for her illegal tours. Naomi comes up with the excuse that those people weren't attending a tour. She lies that they are her family and they're all having a reunion. Arthur plays along with her ruse and pinpoints all the tourists of different nationalities to be their uncles. Naomi adds that this eccentric man in the Abe Lincoln suit is her fiancé. She plants a kiss on his cheek to prove her point, and in response, he takes her in for a passionate kiss. She eventually backs off and now they are required to come up with a specific and detailed description of their first date when they fell in love. They both report that it was at the Grand Central Station. But other than that, their accounts differ greatly. Arthur's idea of their first date is very extravagant, while hers is much simpler. The officers finally leave after saying goodbye to Arthur because they already know him and they've had their fun. Naomi is in awe of who this quirky stranger is when Bitterman drives up to them and Hobson steps out of the car. She declares this is the end of his safari and orders him to get into the car. Naomi smirks and Arthur tries to show that he obeys no one, which is when Naomi questions who these people are. She smiles more when Hobson and Bitterman introduce themselves, after which she returns to her group of tourists and takes her leave. Arthur hopes to see Naomi again, but she responds that she doesn't date men who have nannies. But he manages to get her number before going to his boxing class. He is in the boxing ring with Evander and recounts the adventurous day he had with this girl, who he believes to be his match. He likes her unique worldview, but Hobson is certain that he'll grow bored of her in no time because she's very different from him. Hobson focuses on getting him dressed by 3 p.m. because he has to ask Bert Johnson, Susan's father, for his daughter's hand in marriage. Arthur doesn't agree, so Hobson jumps in the ring with him, adamant about stopping his obsession with random women. He argues with all the observations in Naomi's favor when he suddenly gets knocked out with a punch to his face. Bitterman drives Arthur to the Bert Johnson Tower, where Arthur is confused about what to do next. Bitterman offers his 2 cents on how to woo Bert Johnson, after which Arthur heads inside. He toys around the active construction site with some machine and accidentally pierces Bert Johnson all over his body with nails. Bert is a tough nail and continues to walk with Arthur, who discovers a telescope there that can easily peer into his living room. Bert cuts to the chase and highlights the difference between them. Unlike Arthur, he wasn't born with his billions and had to earn them. He's fine with Susan marrying Arthur because he knows that she can turn him around. He recalls when she once bought a crack house and turned it into a condo. After a very weird and threatening interaction with Bert, Arthur gets permission to marry Susan. Susan and Arthur are at a fancy restaurant for dinner where their orders are worlds apart. He brings up to Susan that he's being forced into a loveless marriage. They have nothing in common, but Susan points out that this is like a business partnership with the added benefit of attraction. She prompts him to propose to her, but he acts wild to show her how wrong he is for her. She manages to keep her cool and discreetly threatens him. This makes him scared enough to pull his act together in front of everyone, stating that embarrassing her, or his family, won't be tolerated at all. So, he falls to one knee and she grabs the ring from his hand and slips it on. Everyone at the restaurant cheers for the happy couple, except for Arthur. That night, he drinks in his Batmobile, and Hobson brings him an aspirin. She gives him a reality check with his daily dose of vitamins, and informs Arthur that she already deleted Naomi's number. But Arthur doesn't give up and crashes Naomi's tour, where she calls him out for never calling her. He takes her inside the Grand Central Station that he had emptied out and booked just for them. This is just like the elaborate first date he described to the officers, and he fulfills his vision down to the last detail. This is much better than the previous dates Naomi has been on before. Arthur is pleased to get her approval and is about to charter a jet to Italy. But she reminds him that he just reserved the Grand Central, so they should stay in this moment and enjoy, instead of rushing on to the next best thing. She shows him her favorite spot in the station where she used to go as a child when she first moved to New York. The Whisper Wall is a really special place where they share a beautiful moment together. She agrees to go on a date, only if he opts for something simple next. They head to Naomi's apartment to have dinner, which is the generic brand Saucios. They both agree that it's delicious and start talking about their parents and childhoods. Arthur stumbles upon the children's stories and pictures Naomi used to write and appreciates them. He encourages her to quit her job and focus all her energy on this. She mentions that she has a lot at stake and things like these don't happen to people like her. Arthur is at his engagement photo shoot with his and Susan's family for a renowned magazine. It turns out that Susan, Bert, and Vivienne know about his date last night, but only Susan confronts him about it. She makes it very clear that it's time for him to say goodbye to his girlfriend or else he'll pay. That night, Hobson warns him not to go out with Naomi again, but he doesn't pay heed to her warnings. She also lectures him that he should come clean to Naomi about his engagement, but he'd rather have his romance. He swings the door open to see Susan instead and screams in terror at this unexpected visitor. She requests Hobson to excuse them for a while and starts to make out with him. This is her attempt to be spontaneous, but Arthur finds this crazy and also notices that she's drunk. Naomi is on her way up, so he takes Susan to his bedroom. He instructs her to wait while he gets ice for all the wild sexual injuries they are going to get tonight. Naomi is brought in by Hobson, who is amused at Arthur's panic and offers to give Naomi a house tour. Hobson takes Naomi to the luxurious home theater where Looney Tunes play all the time, and she is completely fascinated. Meanwhile, Arthur tries to get Susan to cool off a bit in his bedroom. Susan is completely hammered and takes off Arthur's shirt, causing him to fight her off. On the other hand, Naomi and Hobson watch cartoons together, and Hobson learns more about Naomi's life. While they are bonding, Arthur is being dominated by Susan when Hobson walks in on them. She nonchalantly shuts the door, giving Arthur an opportunity to make a run for it. Susan accidentally gets stuck to the bottom of his magnetic bed, and Arthur can't figure out how to rescue her. She might be crushed under the bed if he messes up, so he tries to get Hobson. Arthur is all dressed up when Hobson brings out Naomi. Hobson teaches Arthur to not hurt Naomi's feelings because she has grown to like her. He then requests Hobson to help out Susan, who is still stuck in his bedroom. Following that, Arthur and Naomi head out for their date, which is a romantic night out. She feels cold, so he makes her wear his coat. She notices the patch stitched onto the coat, which shows that it belonged to Arthur's father. Arthur later had it refitted for himself to feel closer to his father. They take a swig from Arthur's flask, and he takes her to the only free fun thing he knows of. He takes her to a pond he always envisioned to be from one of his storybooks as a child. Naomi also recognizes the storybook series as her mother used to read it to her when she was a kid. As they sit under the moonlight in a picnic setting, they discuss old childhood stories and form a connection like no other. Their evening ends with a romantic kiss, after which, Arthur is tucked into bed by Hobson, who reads the same story from his childhood. Arthur confesses to Hobson that he couldn't tell Naomi the truth about his engagement, because he has realized that she is the one for him. He loves her to such an extent that he considers giving up on his wealth for her. He gets the idea of getting an actual job. The next day, he shows up at an office to give his interview to get a job. But he doesn't know any real skills, so he gets a job at a shop at a mall candy store. Time passes and he also grows closer to Naomi, who spends more and more time with him at his house. They do lesbian watching together, while Arthur struggles with having a normal career. He rants about his frustrations to Hobson and arrives at the conclusion that he might have to sober up if he wants to keep a real job. He follows through on his noble intent by going to an AA meeting wearing a disguise, to not harm his distinguished public profile. He listens to other stories and gets extremely bored, so he tries to get out of the meeting. He is about to walk out when Hobson stands up and shares her experience of her past struggles with alcohol consumption. Arthur stops in his tracks and listens attentively to her. He also describes his experience for others to give him a nudge in the right direction. They're in the car when Arthur thanks Hobson for helping him out in there. Later that night, he calls Vivienne and begs her one last time to not make him go ahead with the wedding. Vivienne repeats her vindictive strategy and reminds him that he has the choice to walk away from this wedding and all his generational wealth. Arthur hangs up in desperation at how difficult Vivienne is making his life for him. He follows this by getting drunk and somehow ends up at Naomi's doorstep. Unfortunately, this time her father answers the door while Bitterman shakes his head as he is standing by the car, waiting outside for him. Arthur drunkenly introduces himself and is brought into her room by Naomi. He is staggering drunkenly and finally opens up to her about being engaged to Susan. He apologizes for not disclosing this before, and Naomi stands up in disbelief and disappointment. He explains that he didn't mean for all this to happen initially, but he slowly started falling for her. Then he also mentions that not marrying Susan would mean losing all his money. Naomi understands that he doesn't want to marry Susan, but is only doing so due to his fear of losing all his money. Naomi is visibly upset, and he infuriates her more by proposing that he could keep her in a secret apartment. He goes on about how special she is to him, but she orders him to leave her apartment. He hands her an envelope which is supposed to help with her dad and writing career. The envelope contains a check for almost ₹1,000,000, but Naomi gingerly refuses it. She makes him leave nevertheless, even though he insists on staying. Next, Arthur is at his rehearsal dinner with Susan and mends things with her slightly, which gives her some satisfaction too. Meanwhile, Naomi continues working on her children's book while Arthur spends most of his days sulking. Hobson grows to be unhappier in this situation, as she can detect that whatever is happening is seriously wrong. One day, Bitterman finds him in his bathroom and reports that he's filling in for Hobson, who has a headache. Arthur is concerned and comes to Hobson's room to check up on her. She gives him the command to return 3 books to the library, so Arthur pleads with her not to perish on him. They talk about his situation, and Hobson makes a snide remark about Naomi. Arthur reacts poorly to this and expresses his disapproval of such behavior, because he genuinely cares about Naomi and respects her. This makes Hobson proud of Arthur's character growth. Hobson later shows up at Vivienne's office to convince her to revisit Arthur's marriage situation. She proves all the improvements he's been making in himself, but Vivienne is adamant that it is only Susan who can fix Arthur. Hobson leaves by making a point to Vivienne that Arthur is stronger than what Vivienne perceives him to be. Hobson heads to Naomi's house next while Arthur, Susan, and Vivienne are at their bridal shower. There, Arthur acts immaturely and annoyingly while Hobson implores Naomi not to give up on Arthur. Hobson recognizes that he's truly, genuinely in love with her. Arthur is still at the bridal shower when he gets a call from Naomi. It is to inform Arthur about Hobson's collapse, and that she's in the hospital. Arthur visits her and cheers her up, after which, he goes outside to see Naomi. He demands to know what's happening to Hobson and why she was at Naomi's house in the first place. They catch up and she shares the happy news of her children's story getting selected. They are resolving their issues when Susan gets there and messes everything up. Arthur cares for Hobson throughout her illness, like she did throughout her childhood. He experiences real loss for the first time when Hobson kicks the bucket. Parties and alcohol no longer cheer him up anymore. He drinks heavily and shows up at his wedding completely senseless when he finally discovers a note Hobson left behind for him. He ditches his wedding and attempts to reconcile with Naomi, but that doesn't work. Arthur takes this time to sober himself up and reclaim control of his company. He sees Naomi 6 months later, who takes him back this time because he has grown up to be the man she wanted. The movie ends with Bitterman driving Arthur and Naomi in the Batmobile while police are in pursuit.